Thanks again for the talk. I would like to ask the panel basically what you think about language and communication, because one thing I had thought about with all your talks was that it's not just about looking at the neighbor, at their own needs. It's about ensuring that everybody is able to speak not just the same language as in we know English vocabulary, but as in we appreciate each other as like one global humanity and need to establish and maintain an interconnectivity, so to speak, of mindsets, which is something I got from all of your talks. And we need to be able to do that even when electricity is not on our side, even if things go wrong. So I'd like to just address that generally. And thanks again.
I think language is only one piece of it. Culture is the other piece. The reason why, you know, people keep the windows open in one country might completely not be why other countries keep them closed. And everybody's got windows. So sometimes the infrastructure is the same, but the mechanisms, the historical mechanisms that lead us to our own cultures are different enough that the question of behavioral change becomes a very localized concern. And so we can talk about behavioral change in one country, which means the complete opposite behavior in another country. And I think that that is beyond language. I think English, my mother tongue is French, and I speak Italian and a bit of Dutch and a bit of German. It does not help me in a culture like this one. It helps me nothing. You know, I can't even navigate through Tokyo. I'm just sort of like, okay. But I still manage to, because I still recognize that roads are in a particular way because universally they're in a particular way. People do certain things in certain moments that are very instinctive to how we react to the way cars are incoming, or not sometimes. There are some universalities around how we behave as humans, and there are major differences. And I think culture and language are two different sets of differences that collaborate into making things muddier. But I think that when I talk about making, I might talk about it in a way that someone who's in a developing nation might find highly insulting, because the idea of someone tinkering and playing with electronics, etc., might be closer to what they might know locally as someone who is cleaning off the scraps of and the heaps of electronics somewhere. And so there's and I'm always concerned by that problem, and concerned about the problem of talking about things that are too westernized, for lack of a better expression. So I think that the differences come on many different levels, and language is only part of it.
What she said.
Well, for me, language is very important. It's tied into a lot of the, it's not limited to what age group you may be in. So I think it's a very good question, because so much of the conversation that happens in industry and technology now, increasingly governments are talking about technology, about data. We read license agreements and we just scroll through them. There are a lot of words written on it that we don't understand. I think between the education system, nonprofit, activist groups, we should try to improve our own literacy in some of the new language words, memes that are going around, so that we understand them better together, and that we can, even smart city. As we've seen, many people have different definitions of it, but there's been a consistent meme that has followed. System of systems, then there was a lot of pushback against that, people-centered, poverty, then there's another now, a new way of looking at it. But somehow there have been discussions in conferences such as these, and yet parents, children, students, citizens, the elderly have been left out of these conversations, and that really bothers me. So I think it's important to open up such conversations to the public, have more things like this, not inside museums, but maybe outside in the park or in other places like that. So I think that's an important question we need to think about further.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess the question of also translating if there are so many kind of ways of speaking about something is really important. And are there any other questions?
Hi. I'm curious about
in the process of designing experiences and designing products and designing solutions like the ones that were kind of mentioned here, there's a lot of energy that goes into the production and the ideation of the product itself, and then there is the energy that goes into, in the sake of the products that demand interaction from a lot of users, and there's the energy in transforming that behavior and onboarding people into that system and into that interaction. In your experience, where does more energy go to? And if more energy goes into the onboarding experience and the entering the people into the system, does that make us like behavioral psychologists, more than technologists? Or you get my point? Like, as designers, where most of the energy goes to in these complex systems?
It's a really interesting question. I'm reminded that when I launched PatchBay, it was just me and one other person for quite a long time, Sam Maloubi. And so I was answering most of the emails. And I would say that of the first 3,000 users, I had emails with them directly. And not only was that kind of important for trying to think about how this thing should become, because of course in the first release it was pretty bare bones, and so those first 3,000 kind of had a definite effect on it. But actually, kind of more importantly, for that sense of there being some kind of collective, that this was a kind of I would recognize the email addresses of probably pretty much every one of those people, or their usernames or something, even now. And I do sort of bump into somebody and sort of say, wait a second, were you D. Hunter? And I think that's a really important part of, at least the kind of work that I'm doing, that sense that there is a collective effort going on. And so it is a really fundamental part of it, I would say.
I would say in product design, it's almost all of it is about behavioral change, because you're trying to get someone to use the thing that you've made that they've probably had mechanisms for before. So you're saying that your baby bottle is better than the other people's baby bottle because this one you don't need hands or whatever. There's that psychological, in a way, brainwashing of you need this more because the thing you had before is lacking in some way, is almost all of what product design is about. Because in a Western sense, you go to the Milan Furniture Fair, for example, and people seem to reinvent chairs all the time. And you sort of think that the problem of chairs has been solved, but no, we must design more chairs. So I think that there's an aspect of the product design community, which is only really the one I can talk about, because Usman can talk to, architecture and architectural practice, and yourself to education and educational practice. But in product design, it's almost always about a shift for someone to buy the thing that you've made above anything else. And if you're talking about a completely new behavior, it's harder. And in business speak, you would qualify that as the difference between radical innovation and incremental innovation. Incremental innovation meaning there are things that a consumer will already have used, and so they have a reference point for what you're trying to sell them. Radical innovation, for example, in the case of my lamps, is you have no other mechanism for explaining what you've designed to somebody. And for them, the psychological leap is much larger, and you can feel that that's just a space they don't know how to think about. And I prefer existing in that space because I think that We need, again, back to my last slide, we need radical ideas that don't have a basis in what we're comfortable with, because I think that comfort is something that we're too easily drowning in, but it does make it harder. So I think that, you know, it's really part and parcel what design's about.
I think we have time for one more question. There was a question over there.
I really like the video of the Volvo car. People trust the technology. Yeah, actually, I think it's connected to the Fukushima incident. Actually, I'm from Japan, and when I was elementary school teacher always teach nuclear plant never explode because it's protected by highest level of technology with a 5 degree of protection. But in reality, actually, it was exploded, and it not even as evacuation protocol was there because they very trusted it won't explode. Yeah, but actually nowadays, like recently, the Facebook application realized that actually, even if you turn off the background update, it will kind of tracking your kind of movement or whatever. Yeah. So actually, my question is how you can create trust against technologies. Yeah, because nowadays, okay, even like you are saying future city or smart city, there's some kind of strong trust against the technologies. Yeah. But I think we need, yeah, actually, if we see how the reaction to the Fukushima, somehow people distrust the technology. They are thinking something traditional, historical, is more precious than something new. So how do you kind of build the trust with something new and technology? Yeah.
You raise many interesting points. I think, you know, on the question of safety and trust, for example, in autonomous vehicles, we have not yet figured out collectively, we human beings, what is the appropriate response if a car goes one way and hits a child or swings the other way and hits an elderly person, which is the right way to go? We have not agreed on that yet, but that mechanism is already being encoded by technology companies into machines that are making these decisions on our behalf. And so right now we have to kind of trust their sense of algorithm. We have to trust that somehow most of us will agree with them. I actually think what's really interesting that has come out recently is a whole body of work looking at systems that are based on not trusting. So, you know, you can think about blockchain and Bitcoin, which is actually based on this idea that you don't need trust because that sense of observation is distributed throughout the system. And you can choose which parts to base your decision on. So I didn't actually get to the point of talking about any of my recent work, but it's a lot more about that, building kind of decentralized trust frameworks that don't require you to trust somebody in order to work with them, because I think that's a fundamental part of any participatory system.
I think you were talking about, I mean, your projects are all about the agency as well, giving back the agency to people to decide as well.
I was just going to say, I think that trust is kind of a funny thing because in a way it it's got a very parental anchor to it. So I was sat working on this talk in the lobby of the hotel, which is strangely showing CNN, which should be the last channel I would watch for news. But they had it was a whole kind of piece about Bill Cosby. Who, for an American imagination and someone who's my age who would have grown up with Americanized television, even though I grew up in Paris, you sort of suddenly elevated Bill Cosby to this kind of amazing status of this father figure everybody wanted. And I think maybe we've sort of done that with states and government. We've sort of elevated them to a status of parental guidance that we don't quite know how to, and we don't quite know how to handle a broken relationship to that parent if that relationship breaks. We give them responsibility through our taxes for doing a certain number of things and for doing the jobs that we would never touch, and we don't want the responsibility, we don't want the red button access. And I think that then when we look at judging the decisions that are made, we're conflicted. So we build systems where that conflict, as Sussman was saying, that conflict is embedded in that. Do we trust other people? Do we put anonymity behind it? Is anonymous behavior actually quite negative? Because in some areas it is. Do we encourage people to hide, or do we encourage people to display and share? I think in Singapore, again, from my cabbie conversations, or actually a conversation with CK, who's over there in the room, you have so much data about citizens already that the government already has access to in Singapore, that they can decide what the ethnic mix in any particular area is. And if you apply for housing, you get kind of a yay or a nay, depending on how many other ethnicities are in an area. And that is trusting the government with a lot of information about yourself that in other areas of the world would be, impossible. You would say that that was being done in other areas in the world, they'd be like, oh my God, this is shocking. So I think trust is also cultural and also embedded in local knowledge, local communities, and local cohesion and local politics, really.
That's a really good point. I mean, trust is dependent on the culture and the history of a particular country, but as we see now in Singapore as well, the politic is coming up with new standards for what it would allow the government or for society or corporations to trust or not trust. I think it's very interesting to hear you say that people don't trust technology. I think the problem is we very easily, or all too easily, trust it all the time, unthinkingly so, many times. But I like what Usman talked about with the blockchains. But remember, any new technology then feeds back into society. So I was just reading about the first marriage contract through blockchains, and the idea that then you can set a limit to it. So then the people are thinking about all kinds of new ways in which it would change the social contract we have between each other, between husbands and wives and other parents and children, or governments and citizens. So when new technologies occur, they help in some ways, but they also have reverberations in society. And it can be good or bad or neither, but it's important to think through all these things.
And on that slightly paranoid tinge note, we are going to have to end this session. Thank you to all our speakers, Aisha, Alex, and Usman for speaking today.